Atheists United is deeply concerned about the preservation of the wall of separation between church and state, as provided by our First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Quote, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. This freedom to practice any religion or none is cherished by most Americans, but this freedom is under threat from radical right-wing fundamentalist Christians as never before. They battle for mandatory prayer in public schools, tax exemptions that shortchange public services, and in many other insidious ways they seek to impose their biblical rules and regulations on our secular society. In 1947, Americans United for Separation of Church and State was organized to fight for one purpose: maintenance of the wall of separation between church and state. This entails monitoring and fighting all encroachments of religionists into secular life, all efforts to demolish that precious wall of separation. Atheists United applauds and supports the efforts of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, a concern we wholeheartedly share. The following program was videotaped at an organizing meeting for a local active chapter of Americans United. Mr. Edward Tabash, a prominent local attorney who is actively involved with a number of organizations concerned with this issue, was the main speaker. It is the pleasure of Atheists United to bring you highlights of Mr. Tabash's informative speech.
I think the best way to begin is by saying that the activism to keep church and state separate in no way rejects the common knowledge that whether one is a believer or non-believer in religion, there has been a desperation throughout human history for people to find some kind of eternal permanence. There are many people, I would say most believers in religion, who want to find an anchor in the universe that may never be shattered. They want their consciousness to live forever, and they want to feel that there is an all-powerful parent figure that will ultimately right every wrong. It is understandable how people may search for and want to discover such transcendental permanence. And it's understandable how religions grew out of this yearning. It is equally understandable how other people, notwithstanding the impulse to find some kind of fairy tale ending to life, choose not to believe in what they can't see or experience, and choose not to accept certain dogmatic claims about the supernatural as proof in the absence of proof. So both the believer and the non-believer have motivations and frameworks which are understandable. However, it is in a free society the role of government to keep out of the way. The purpose of Americans United for Separation of Church and State is to ensure that those who want to desperately find some transcendental power to believe in their lives are free to do so, and those who wish to reject any and all concepts of the supernatural are free to do so, and that the government does not play favorites in dealing with either of the two approaches or with any combination or eclectic amalgam of those two approaches. And so it's our view that the worship of whatever God one chooses, or the lack of worship in any God, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, neither picks our pockets nor breaks our legs for our neighbors to worship no God or 20 gods. And it is the role of government not to promote any specific theological belief and not to promote any theological belief. In the 1960s, there was a revolution against some traditions and a belief that religious dogma should not constrain particularly a human being's right for sexual exploration and experimentation. In the 70s, the so-called sexual revolution settled in and was considered part of the norm. Beginning with the 1980 presidential election, we saw a new political, spiritual phenomenon in this country with the rise of the religious right wing, at that time embodied by Jerry Falwell's moral majority. President Ronald Reagan's campaign was the first campaign for the presidency in American history in which a major portion of the campaign was based upon the candidates pledging fidelity to a fundamentalist religious doctrine. And so, with the help of the religious right wing, with the Christian fundamentalists, Ronald Reagan succeeded to the presidency, where he began to speak not just of vague general concepts of God, but tried to embrace specific Christian fundamentalism. He said, as president, that all the answers to the world's problems are contained in the Bible. He said in the 1980 campaign that the Bible has to be literally true because otherwise it would mean that Jesus was lying to us, which was not possible for him to consider. And rising along with this religious fundamentalism were specific issue movements, the most powerful of which, beginning in the mid-70s, was the anti-abortion movement. And even though there was a broad agenda of right-wing religious believers involved in politics, it seemed that their main area of concentration, or the one that got the most publicity, was a desire to ban abortion. And then, in recent years, the desire to deny persons of homosexual inclination equal freedom and citizenship also became a cemented part of the agenda. In the 1980 presidential campaign, a lot of religious right-wing leaders like Paul Weyrich talked openly about Christianizing America. Jerry Falwell talked openly about returning society to biblical morality. And then in the early 80s, another powerful voice emerged on the religious right, a man whose opinions are so extreme that if he wouldn't have such power, he would be deemed comical, and that is the Reverend Pat Robertson, who said that the separation of church and state is a myth created by the left, that it's a concept that derives from the Soviet Constitution, and who said that we have to secure the imposition of Christianity in America, and that the United States Constitution only works if Christians are in control of the government. The evangelical preachers of this persuasion raised millions, if not billions, of dollars in the 1980s, and now are among the wealthiest political forces in this country. Their agenda includes the superimposition of prayer in the public school system. Now, in 1962-63, the United States Supreme Court held that the states could not push prayer in the public schools. The religious right claims that our side kicked prayer out of the public schools. But again, that fails to comprehend the purpose of limited government, which they otherwise themselves support. Nobody kicked prayer out of public schools because someone can always pray if they want to at any moment. But what we did do is secure that schools, which are a branch and an arm of government, would not be involved in the prayer business, that prayer is a matter of private concern. It's also interesting the way the religious right wing that otherwise embraces the concept of privacy and limited government gets very upset at the notion of privacy in terms of personal sexual freedom and in terms of freedom of belief. Their number one legal champion, Robert Bork, who was defeated for the United States Supreme Court in 1987, felt that the Constitution didn't even protect the right of privacy to permit people to use birth control in the privacy of their own homes. And this was applauded by the religious right wing. Now, while fundamentalist Protestants and fundamentalist Catholics have been at odds with each other over doctrinal issues, they have come together on many religious right issues, not just abortion, but also in diverting public monies to support parochial schools. The Archbishop of Philadelphia has said that the system of vouchers for private schools will hopefully be the #1 wedge into dismantling the wall of separation of church and state. And this has also been echoed by Cardinal O'Connor in New York. And in his own muddled way, our own Cardinal Roger Mahony has given assent to that proposition. So the push for diverting public monies to parochial schools and the push to have prayer in public schools would be the method by which they would begin to erode the separation of church and state. Also, the advent of numerous statewide initiatives around the country to deprive gay and lesbians of personal freedoms is also spawned by religious right-wing sentiment. Now, while fundamentalist Protestants and fundamentalist Catholics have been at odds with each other over doctrinal issues, they have come together on many religious right issues, not just abortion, but also in diverting public monies to support parochial schools. The Archbishop of Philadelphia has said that the system of vouchers for private schools will hopefully be the #1 wedge into dismantling the wall of separation of church and state. And this has also been echoed by Cardinal O'Connor in New York. And in his own muddled way, our own Cardinal Roger Mahony has given assent to that proposition. So the push for diverting public monies to parochial schools and the push to have prayer in public schools would be the method by which they would begin to erode the separation of church and state. Also, the advent of numerous statewide initiatives around the country to deprive gay and lesbians of personal freedoms is also spawned by religious right-wing sentiment. And the whole concept of separation of church and state is under threat. Because of the skewing of the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan and George Bush, we are just about 1 or 2 votes on the Supreme Court away from the total scuttling of that barrier, that very intelligent and conscientious barrier to protect the separation of church and state. Even Justice Anthony Kennedy, who has been the deciding vote on some close cases, has said that he believes that government can accommodate religion. But that is which religion? Justice O'Connor has said that the accommodation of religion, though she at times has favored it, is a dangerous concept, and has come up with a surprisingly good definition of the separation of church and state, which means that no branch of government, either federal, state, local, county, or city, may in any way make any American feel more or less included in society because of that person's religious beliefs or lack of religious beliefs. And this is a very marvelous way of capturing this concept of neutrality. But yet, there are justices on the court that would allow government to push religion. Justice Scalia, one of the strongest right-wing forces on the Supreme Court, has referred to the Lemon versus Kurtzman test and the wall of separation of church and state generally as like a ghoul in a late-night horror movie that refuses to die and that needs to finally be killed off. Chief Justice Rehnquist has said that the wall of separation of church and state and the concept separation of church and state has no basis in history and is useless as a tool for judging these cases. But in the past 6 years, the religious right wing has begun something even more insidious and more dangerous than their legal assault. They have started to organize in local precincts and local school districts. Here in California, in Vista, in North San Diego County, they took over a few years ago the local school board and have been trying to push prayer in public schools and trying to push creationism as equivalent with evolution as a scientific theory. In Lake County, Florida, where the electorate finally defeated some of these school members, they tried to push a Christian curriculum on the school system under the guise of teaching the superiority of American culture to any other culture. Pat Robertson's multi-million-dollar industry involves a new organization called the Christian Coalition, which is the showcase for such people as Oliver North and Dan Quayle's presidential aspirations. Within the past 2 years, Pat Robertson made the comment that the feminist agenda promotes primarily women leaving their husbands, killing their children, practicing witchcraft, destroying capitalism, and becoming lesbians. And yet, this man is taken seriously as a spiritual leader by millions of Americans. Because persons who are used to a sense of total devotion to a religious calling have mastered the art of throwing themselves completely into the task at hand. This is why the religious right is able to raise millions and millions of dollars. This is why they're able to organize in ever more larger numbers of political precincts around the country, and this is why they're able to take over local school boards, because they believe everything they are doing is motivated by God. And so we have to, regardless of what our beliefs are or non-beliefs, have to erect a kind of constitutional God, the First Amendment, and worship it with its separation of church and state, and worship the love of freedom with the equivalent fervor that the religious right foot soldiers bring to their efforts to undo the separation of church and state. Pat Robertson has also said that no one outside of Christians or Jews should be running the government in any way. He used to say Christians, then he included Jews. You have people like Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition talking about returning this country to its Christian roots. You have the Republican Party of the state of Arizona and Texas and Minnesota saying the law of Jesus Christ must be the law of the land. And you also have the most consummate idiot who ever was elevated to high public office in American life, Dan Quayle, becoming a serious contender for the presidency of the United States almost exclusively on his promise to use government as a battering ram to impose religion-based values forcibly on the American people. The Freedom from Religion Foundation, based in the state of Wisconsin, of which I'm also a life member, is currently promoting a lawsuit to try to remove In God We Trust from our money. At Americans United, it's not that we don't believe these are violations, it's that with not infinite resources, we can't address every problem, and we have to focus only on those legal issues where we think we have a chance of winning. It would be the most wonderful surprise in the world to me if the Freedom from Religion Foundation would prevail on this. But of course, on the Pledge of Allegiance issue, we go back to the 1940s, and the Barnett case, where the United States Supreme Court held that no one could be required to recite the Pledge of Allegiance because it's not the role of government to prescribe what's orthodox in terms of patriotism and in terms of belief. So I think that even though it violates the separation of church and state for government to push the Pledge of Allegiance, for any branch of government to do so, at least we have a blanket constitutional protection that allows us to opt out of it. And the joke about the money is that that money passes through the hands of so many people who do not trust in God that it actually is a joke. But again, the violation is obvious, and that is government has no business speaking collectively on matters of faith for the people. When my government says, "In God we trust," my government is purporting to speak for me. Let's say I had a horrible event that week that completely destroyed my faith in anything sublime and anything supernaturally perfect. Then my government is lying because I'm no longer part of that we. It's the same as chaplains opening up prayer meetings at legislative bodies where the government, the Supreme Court, has just looked the other way and said if something is a muddled kind of a bland general reference to God, part of some vague concept known as civic religion, that it gets by. Technically, that's wrong. Any reference to deity by government should not be permitted. You raise an excellent point. To the extent, you see, we're not siding with anybody. It depends what stands they take. We never wanted it to be that the religious right wing took over the Republican Party, but they did. Factually, nobody can dispute the fact that if you read the Republican Party platform, if you look at that incredibly religiously intolerant and vicious convention that they held in 1992, we didn't make them the enemy, they made themselves the enemy. If it had happened that Jerry Falwell rose in the Democratic Party and that Reagan had run in 1980 claiming that he didn't want to use government to impose religion because he believed in limited government, and Carter ran on the platform that we must restore religious values in this country, even forcibly, because otherwise there's moral decline, I would be saying the same thing about what's happening in the Democratic Party. But the reality is that every single major religious right-wing leader in this country today is organizing within the Republican Party. Pat Robertson was even a Republican presidential candidate in 1988. George Bush in 1988 made a comment that I just have to say is incredibly dumb even for George Bush. He said that atheists could not be patriots. Dan Quayle is a phenomenon in the Republican Party. We wish that that would not be so, but since every single enemy of church-state separation who matters, who really has a chance of eroding our freedoms, is manifesting within the Republican Party, we have no choice but to deal with them. That's why I was a lot of church-state people don't do this, separationists, but I began my presentation in talking about the religious right by saying that if they were true conservatives, they would not take this viewpoint. They'd want government to leave people alone in matters of faith. So I was sensitive to that, but I can't change the fact that every single threat to the separation of church and state is coming from powerful preachers who are not only identified with, but have control over the policies of the Republican Party today. That's a reality I can't change. So until the Republican Party changes, or until the Democratic Party is taken over by the religious right, I have no choice but to speak about the past 14 years of history as it really happened. Those of us who have the benevolent objective of preserving personal liberty have a mindset where we're not designed to hate the infidel. They are. So videos to arouse passion, videos to arouse the us versus them mentality works better for them than for us. In 1983, Jerry Falwell raised millions of dollars by sending out a letter. This was already 11 years ago, 82 or 83, to a lot of senior citizens saying, unless you send me money, your grandchildren will be homosexual. And he raised millions doing that. And the thing is, except for very few of us, if we send out letters to all the people who agree with us and say, unless you send us money, your grandchildren will not be permitted to manifest their personal sexuality as a matter of choice or of lifestyle freedom, we would not raise back the same money that Falwell. In other words, if we did the opposite message that Falwell did, saying, unless you send us money, your grandchildren won't have the freedom to be whatever they are, we would not get back the same millions as what Falwell did in saying that we have to stop this from happening. So the defenders of freedom can't seem to get the same fanatic devotion as the hate mongers who want to erode the liberty. That's why I said I wish there was some kind of secular God for which I nominate the First Amendment that could become our icon, that we could believe in as fervently as they do in their God.
This program is a part of Atheist United's TV outreach series made possible by a generous grant from the James Hervey Johnson Charitable Education Trust. For more information about Americans United for Separation of Church and State or Atheist United, contact us at Atheist United, Post Office Box 57435, Sherman Oaks, California 91413, or call us at area code 818, number is 785-1743.